All right, well, welcome back to the Art of Argument and our discussion of our first fallacy, the ad fontem arguments. Who here can tell me what the Latin words ad fontem mean? Yes, Noah?
To the source.
To the source. So what would that have to do with our discussion of a fallacy of relevance?
We're addressing the source of the argument, so the person making the argument, not necessarily the argument itself.
Okay, that's right. In Latin, or the word fountain means fountain, and we are thinking of fountain sort of symbolically as the source for water or for sustenance in some way. And so we're going back to the source of the argument, and this is where the fallacy is taking place in the discussion that we're going to be having as we look at the fallacy itself. We're going to go and it's sort of be attacking the source of the argument, which means we're attacking the person. Right? Okay, so when we attack somebody in an argument, what does that look like? Are we fists flying and, are we kicking someone, bludgeoning them to death, that sort of thing? Pickaxe, does it turn into a horror film? What does this attack look like when we talk about attacking?
Generally, it takes the form of insults.
Okay. Anything else? Mm-hmm.
We say that because of the character, who the person is or their circumstance, or other things having to do with the source itself, that their argument should be discredited, that they shouldn't be counted just because of them.
Very good, very good. Yes, we're talking about discrediting or trying to discredit the source of the argument, one of the two arguers, and we're trying to cast them in a negative light and somehow by either hurling insults at them or by maligning them in some way. And we can do that in very obvious ways, which we'll come up with some examples here to discuss. And some of our examples are going to be pretty obvious, that they're an obvious verbal attack. But sometimes they can be a little bit more subtle as well. Where they don't necessarily look like an obvious attack on someone. They might seem like they're being quite rational, right? And those are the real tricky ones that we have to kind of be watching out for. So let's get started with some of these more obvious personal attacks that may take the form of an insult. Who has someone that they'd like to share? I feel like I'm watching a tennis match. Back and forth across the court.
Well, a lot of times on the playground, kids they'll say, well, why won't you do that? You're just a scaredy cat. And that's it. The reason that's an abusive fallacy, because they're being persuasive by means of insults rather than actual clear, valid reasoning.
Okay. Again, we go back to what those 4 questions are that Dr. Perrin or Chris talked about earlier in our last session. And the first question that we have to ask ourselves is what?
What's the issue?
What is the real issue? And in that case, what is the real issue? What's the real argument that's trying to be made? What would be the real argument that's trying to be made?
You should do whatever they want them to do.
Right. The real argument in the playground scenario is you ought to go down the slide, play on the swings, use the monkey bars, whatever it is. You ought to be doing this, and the reason that you're not willing to do it is that there's some character flaw that you have, right? That's the argument that they're trying to make. Okay, so that's a more obvious personal attack. Are there other examples we could use of obvious personal attacks?
In courtrooms,
Okay.
when the witnesses, sometimes the opposing lawyer, the prosecutor, or the defender will try to remove the witness by claiming that his testimony is not valid because of past circumstances or a certain character flaw,
Okay.
etc. And the judge has to then determine whether or not that argument is based on firm, substantial proof that is correct. I think that's a little more subtle.
Okay, that can be a little bit more subtle argument where maybe the person that's on the stand is someone who has a criminal record of some kind. Let's say maybe they've shoplifted when they were 15 years old. But now they're 35 years old and they're sitting in a courtroom and they're discussing whether or not someone's a good parent or a fit parent or something along those lines. Would it be appropriate for a prosecutor in that situation to say, well, we can hardly take the word of Dr. Perrin because when he was 15 years old, he stole a Hershey bar from the 7-Eleven. And this is the kind of individual that we are having to to determine whether or not someone else is a good and decent person. This person is a thief, a common thief. It's going to be all right.
I need a good defense attorney.
Is when we're calling someone a name, that kind of thing, when we're calling them out as being a thief, there may be a problem there. What is the real issue at hand? And what's the real argument that's trying to be made?
Because of their past, that you can't take their testimony.
Okay, because of a mistake that Dr. Perrin made, and if he's only in his 30s, 15 years ago, that he's no longer a credible witness in a case that has absolutely nothing to do with it, and they're trying to malign him in front of the jurors and the judge so that his witness or his testimony would be discredited in some way. Okay, are there other examples that you came with?
One I had was only a creature hater would use pesticide, but the whole point of pesticide is to kill bugs, so of course you're going to want to kill them. So they're just insulting the person for reason.
A creature hater.
Exactly.
A creature hater.
You bug hater. The bugs as well have a right to subside, to exist. Yeah, but you know you that in some countries, like there are some religious views that would say you should do no harm to any form of life. So to some folks that might actually be persuasive based on some assumptions that they're making, but typically not.
As far as a creature hater goes, what kind of weight does that carry? What kind of weight what does it sound like?
Sounds like you're an animal abuser, like cats or dogs or something, when you're just talking about ants or flies or something.
Okay. Yeah, creature hater carries with it a weightiness that you're unable to distinguish between the stink bug that has run rampant through central Pennsylvania over the last couple of years and small children, pets, that sort of thing. And that, a creature hater, you've just, have this blanket loathing for all things living, right?
Yeah.
And so we're casting a negative light and then potentially trying to discredit the person whose action or decision is under scrutiny. Right.
Back in Minnesota, we would have, during the summer, box elder bugs. They're coming out of our air vents. Mm-hmm. So we were having like streams of bugs coming out of the vents in our houses, and we would have to vacuum them up and burn them, and it went on for days. That was horrible.
Sounds like one of the plagues.
Nonetheless,
Yeah,
that doesn't excuse you from being a creature hater.
Yeah, it does.
And they say man is a rational animal, so there's a difference between hating man and hating the little elder bugs.
Yeah,
that's true.
But, you could extend this particular argument to one that's more common about the environment. Mm-hmm. And I would go on record saying we need to care for our environment, but the way the debates go, sometimes people will be accused of not caring for our environment based on a certain action. For example, if you use certain kinds of fertilizers, pesticides would be the case as well, or development. If a developer wants to build some houses and a forest needs to be removed in order to build houses, people will sometimes use ad hominem arguments and say things that are abusive, like, this person wants to rape our landscape in order to build more disposable housing, for the area, this kind of thing. And using words like rape and people who don't care, and so you'll see these adjectives being injected into into the arguments that describe their opponents. But that can happen in any kind of controversial issue. Military spending, and political issues are rife with this kind of thing. Can you think of any political issues where people are being disparaged for their position regarding, say, a war or health care, or that's been big, or other political issues that our country faces?
The tax cuts.
Tax cuts. So on either side of that issue, either we want to raise taxes or reduce them. You maybe could argue, or keep them the same. But if you're going to raise or reduce taxes, how are people who want to raise taxes sometimes described in insulting language, and how are people who want to reduce taxes sometimes described in insulting terms?
Well, the people who lower tax, who sometimes want to cut tax, I've heard a couple times, they're often described as not wanting our government to have enough money to be able to support those who are in need. So they're almost described as people haters because they're not providing for the needy.
Sometimes they're not compassionate, right? It's
Yeah.
you lack compassion if you're not for programs that are based on taxes. But this is Jolie's specialty, who really studies political science and has for some time. What do you think about that?
Well, I was thinking that's a very good example. Usually, the people who are looking to have a tax cut are usually the highest or the wealthiest people in the country. So when we talk about giving a tax break to the highest or the wealthiest paid individuals in our country, then it looks like we're giving tax breaks and special treatment to the wealthy, and that the lower class people still have to pay their full taxes and those sorts of things. So that then there turns into some slander about, with regard to the wealthy people. Can you think of what we call how that idea is sometimes described, where we give tax breaks to the top tier of our society, the wealthiest individuals? Seth looks like he's trying to reach for it. What's that?
Tight-belted, greedy individuals who are trying to just maintain their wealth. And
Exactly. Who's giving out the tax breaks? Well, that would be, usually the president and Congress, and those, we could probably put most of those people into that higher bracket, that higher socioeconomic bracket, right? And so they would be giving tax breaks to their friends who are also in this wealthy tax bracket as well. And so people who are more middle class and lower class watching these tax breaks going on for, between friends almost, we sometimes hear terms like greedy, uncompassionate, those types of, maybe they'll say things like Wall Street types. As soon as you start talking about Wall Street types, what do you think of? Is that positive or negative? When you call someone
That's negative.
Like snobby aristocracy.
Sure, right. Yeah, they're all about just getting more money, more and more for themselves, and who cares about the little guy, right? That kind of thing. And so the argument then, instead of talking about what would be the pros and cons of giving tax breaks or tax incentives to the upper or middle class and that sort of thing, we start throwing out those sorts of derogatory terms, like we just said, and it frames the argument so that it looks like those people giving the tax breaks and the ones receiving the tax breaks then are all about maybe indentured servitude and child labor, and that they don't really care about anybody at all, and that sort of thing. And that may not be quite the right way to look at the issue. Okay, so maybe we can move on to a different topic here. Let's see, are there any other times, and politics is a good place to look, but we don't have to limit it to just politics. Are there any other places where we get into that kind of person bashing?
Companies often do it.
Companies?
Especially, I've noticed lately, car companies are really bashing each other over cars.
Okay, can you give me an example of how one car company might bash another car company?
Let's see, one company would say, this car sold by this company isn't actually as good as they say. They work for, this isn't actually what they say, but they support a company in South America that is cutting down the jungles and not taking care of our planet. I know this actually happens to my dad's work. They're worried about, there's these groups now that are accusing the cocoa guys, some of the companies support these companies that are cutting down palm trees down in South Africa for palm oil, which they need. and they're accusing them of destroying natural habitat and not being economically concerned. And that's something that my dad's company is preparing for. They're trying to gear themselves to be more green.
Okay.
And which I could, and because it's damaging,
Okay.
and several companies have been severely damaged by it.
You're right. There are, and the example that you're sharing is one that is part of the ad fontem arguments as a whole. It's not specifically an ad hominem argument. Can you tell me why the example that you just gave might not be an example of an ad hominem argument, but is still an example of an ad fontem argument?
Because it's not really accusing the company directly, but accusing something about the argument, or about the company's... No, I can't do it.
You're pretty close. Can you explain?
Yeah, the argument, they aren't directly insulting a personal attribute, rather they are just discrediting the source or the circumstances of a company. And they're saying that the company is environmentally concerned, therefore all of their ideas are bad.
Exactly. You're right. The argument is still going back to the source. It's attacking the source of an argument. In this case, the source of the argument happens to be a company or an organization, and then the circumstances surrounding that company or organization. So that particular argument would probably fit best into a genetic fallacy, because it's not naming one specific person. The way we would maybe talk about way people sort of maligned George W. Bush when he was president as being sort of a bubbling buffoon, cowboy that couldn't string two words together and, misspelled everything and got all of his analogies mixed up. He was just a crazy old coot kind of thing, where they would be, discrediting one person. You're talking about discrediting an entire organization because of the circumstances surrounding that organization. And that's still an ad fontem argument. And that brings up a very good point as we talk about the ad fontem arguments, that the ad hominem abusive, and the genetic fallacies, they are all very closely related in because they are an attack, and they do seem to be personally geared at your father's company, and so it feels personal, perhaps. And that's one of the things we have to look for when we're talking about these fallacies, is being able to distinguish between just a pure attack on one specific individual, which would be an ad hominem, the circumstances surrounding one specific individual, which would be an ad hominem circumstantial, and then a genetic fallacy, which would be an attack on an organization of some kind, or an entire idea group, that kind of thing. So that's a good point to bring up. Anybody else have any more ad fontem arguments to bring up? Any? Can you think of ways that people characterize, not that you all would ever do this, but your teachers perhaps, or your siblings, your parents, presidents, heads of organizations that are relatively famous people? Can you think of ways that people are maligned? No? I used the example of George W. Bush. Anyone else? Anybody else you can?
Heads of companies are often classified as rich, greedy, only concerned with themselves people.
Okay.
And they're very subject to that. And the teachers are subject to being just called bad, hard to understand.
Controlling.
Yeah, over. Like, you can also see it in some schools, like Teacher's Pet.
Okay.
You can see it like that. Just stuff like that.
How about
Name-calling?
police officers? How are police officers sometimes mischaracterized?
As being overly strict, being a stickler. Or
Lovers of power and control. There was a time when in the 60s they were called pigs. And people were so angry with their perception of police officers is they were just kind of enforcing unjust rules and so forth. And so they were maligned by certain subgroup for a while. And police officers know that sometimes, like if you get pulled over for a speeding ticket or some minor traffic violation, sometimes this defense comes to view if you're the person being pulled over. Why are you pulling me over for just, rolling through that stop sign? Aren't there enough criminals and, homicides to investigate and to take care of? Here you are pulling, this is ridiculous. The more important stuff is being neglected. That's what I said. It didn't go too well.
I was just recently pulled over for my registration being expired on my car, and I met up with a very nice police officer, so I can't contribute to this sort of back talk or negative talk about police officers. I had a wonderful experience and only a written warning, so that was perfect. What about what if I said, would a Hollywood actor ever make a good president of the United States?
Potentially, but most likely not.
Potentially, but most likely not.
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan.
Oh, okay.
Imagine if, or a bodybuilder. Let's
Governor.
Governor. Would a Austrian-born bodybuilder ever make a good governor of a state?
And a Hollywood actor.
And a Hollywood actor. That might be questionable.
Wasn't that actually
I'll be
governor
back.
who was?
Yes, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Ronald Reagan was our 40th president of the United States, and he was a Hollywood actor. I mean, do you think maybe there was any negative language associated or maligning him? What sorts of things can you imagine today if a Hollywood actor was assuming to legitimately run for the presidency of the United States? Now, remember, it took Reagan 3 or 4 tries, I want to say, to get in. It wasn't like he was an overnight success. He went straight from Hollywood to president. He became the governor of California for several years and had several bids at the White House beforehand. But what would some of the things be said? Can you imagine some of those sorts of things being said?
It'd be really easy to object to their honesty, Well, you're just acting. You're so good at it. How can we believe you?
Okay.
And then you could.
He's not really a president. He just plays one on TV.
But it'd be really easy to commit on him an abusive fallacy, calling them a liar.
Okay. You could say that that they're a liar, or maybe not necessarily going all the way to call them a liar necessarily, but we have no way of determining whether or not this individual is telling the truth. Mm-hmm. Any other?
Maybe
sorry. You're just an actor. What would you know about politics? 'Cause all you do is act all day. You don't know anything about the real world.
Okay.
That's what I was going to say. More of a circumstantial sort of approach.
Okay. Anything else about a specific person? Ronald Reagan and his bid for the presidency. Imagine what was said. Anything else? Do we know anything else about Ronald Reagan? No, probably a little too long ago.
No. Well, sort of.
He was also a rancher, so he's another, sort of hardy cowboy type. Anything else that could be said? Where do the best, what sort of breeding are most presidents? Where are they from?
Harvard.
Like
Possibly
New
Harvard.
England
Maybe New England.
and Virginia.
Okay, so perhaps we could get into something about Ronald Reagan just being, what would a Hollywood actor and cowboy know anything about, running the country or dealing with Afghanistan, for example, or the Lebanese government or terrorism.
Like Sarah Palin, a few years ago when she was getting attacked because everybody said she wouldn't really know anything about. She was too inexperienced.
Okay.
They say the same thing about Obama. A lot of critics will say, well, he never ran a company, so how can he run a government? All he was a community organizer. So he doesn't understand business, and that's a big part of the American economy and politics because he never ran a business.
So President Obama, being with some of his inexperience, he's perhaps been maligned, and then he's quite young as well. So it could also, and perhaps John F. Kennedy ran into the same thing. Who knows? In his case, whether or not it was President Obama's He's just this young Chicago-born,
Hawaiian-born,
I should say. Question
Chicago
mark.
raised.
So Chicago raised. Yes, this young Hawaiian-born international traveler that has been a community organizer. It sounds like it's far too youthful and inexperienced to be able to run the country. And then we can look now and gauge whether or not he's done a good job or not. But yes, some of those sorts of things are the types of abusive, condescending arguments and things. So that might be a good place to sort of wrap up, and we can move on to the ad hominem circumstantial next.